What do you really know about witches? There are many stories about witches and witchcraft. These creatures have long been romanticized in the West, usually depicted as snaggle-toothed, hunched-over creatures with hideously long noses, usually with the most bulbous-looking wart perched at the tip. Their attire is normally flowy, but not bohemian flowy, but more dark, impoverished, like they are hoping their clothes will hide the stains and their transgressions. And they almost always have a bundled sack with them, full of suspect charms and other odd, slightly smelly trinkets, to attract the innocents. The idea of witches in this part of the world is slightly comical. Watching the Sanderson sisters in Hocus Pocus was a real treat in my childhood. They were sweet and slightly hilarious, if we ignored the kidnapping and eventually killing of children. Hocus Pocus was a tradition every Halloween, even though we didn't celebrate the day. One depiction of witches that was truly terrifying was the movie The Witches. It left me feeling cold, bereft, and very afraid, even as a child. The scene of the little girl in the picture slowly aging and moving around the photo was chilling. But as an adult, I realized there is way worse. In West Africa, there is still a deeply held belief in traditional beliefs, particularly witchcraft, even with the introduction and enforcement of Christianity during the colonial era. What if I were to tell you that people really do believe in the existence of witches and actually fear them? There are people who actively hunt witches to kill them. This is not as widespread as you would believe, but when it does happen, it is fairly remote, and the consequences are devastating. Sadly, children seem to bear the brunt of being accused as witches and of witchcraft. Even though no evidence seems to exist, the idea of witches continues to pervade our minds. When I first got the idea for the Heathens series, it was fairly light. But as I began to write it, from a more worldly point of view, it became much darker. The influences I had heard about as a child worked their way into the story. All the stories, the myths and legends I'd been told came to life, and I began to see these stories as reality. Where I come from, superstition is alive and well. We do certain things that highlight our superstitions and our superstitious nature, no matter how much we try to hide it. It comes alive within us. It's as though these superstitions are now a part of who we are. I began rewriting Heathens the way witching stories should be told, dark and bloody. I was uncertain if it would be appreciated. After all, readers were used to rather light and comical books. I also wanted to incorporate mythical characters from African myths and legends. I knew we had a lot of them in Nigeria. I'd been brought up on their stories. This was usually a ploy to keep me in line, and it worked. Some of the stories were terrifying. First of all, I wanted to work on a prequel. Very important if you want people to get a taste of your writing. The prequel was surprisingly easy to write. I just stared at a blank page for a few minutes, and the next words that came to my mind were dark, enchanted island. I wanted the island to hold a secret that was perhaps extremely dangerous, even to witches and warlocks. It all came together so seamlessly I almost cried. I had it. An uninhabited island, a perilous rescue, a dark magic. 2 warlocks wait for a signal that will launch a rescue mission on a strange island, but things are not as they seem. And I decided to call it Heathens, a perilous rescue. I wanted the short story to have far-reaching consequences for the rest of the series. As I wrote, names came very naturally to me. So did locations, plot lines, and scenes. The whole point of writing it was for it to have devastating consequences and a ripple effect. 2 warlocks and a witch on a rescue mission. What could go wrong? These warlocks and witches weren't just evil as normally depicted. They were in a life or death situation and fighting their own brand of evil. They had the good versus evil balance in their world too. They were subject to checks and balances by a higher power, as well as trying to keep humans out of their world and stay hidden. They were hiding in plain sight. I'm glad to say those who've read the books have adored them. It was fascinating to capture them in their world and build an entire world around them. I dare say it was a privilege and one that I may never be able to replicate. But every story is unique, so is every book. Nothing is ever meant to be the same. The world building was the best part of the series. But getting to write witches, warlocks, and magical folk exactly as I think they would exist was amazing. You see, growing up with 2 very different versions of witches and stories around the occult was fascinating to me. If you do a search for witchcraft and children in Nigeria, there are some horrible stories of misguided adults torturing and in some instances killing these children. I feel this might be more mental health related. Just like anywhere else in the world, but in this case the children are believed to be witches. I believe that in stories involving witches, the innocence of children will always be a target, just like women were back in the day. They will always go for the innocents and those who can't protect themselves. They will always prey on the weak. Incorporating these 2 rather dark worlds into the books were fascinating and a source of great enjoyment. Although witches only seem to occur in popular culture, they are certainly alive in some parts of the world, living on in our hearts and minds and causing havoc. Sometimes when a child goes missing, we are very quick to say something unnatural has taken them, rather than laying the blame on a dark, devious adult who holds too many secrets. The myth of witches will always remain popular and a great story to tell, as long as we can find new storytelling strategies. Long may the legend of the witches live on.